All right, good evening, guys. As promised, coming to you with a video to help with the migration terms that I assigned to you. I'm going to go through the ones that have been problematic for people in the past and just make sure that they're clear for your test tomorrow. We're going to start with chain migration, the first one. I find students have a hard time with the scale of chain migration. Students will write examples down like, well, some Chinese immigrants came to the United States, they liked it a lot, so more people from China came to the United States. Chain migration is a very specific type of migration. In my hometown of Parma, Ohio, there's a large Ukrainian population. Now let me tell you, there's nothing exciting whatsoever about Parma, Ohio. We said Japan's the oldest country. Western Europe is the oldest region in terms of population. Parma, Ohio has got to be the oldest city in the United States as far as the average age of the people. I think the average age is 99. There's nothing exciting about going to Parma. It's just home for me. But the Ukrainian population found success. They found a place to live in Parma, and they migrated there. They sent word back to the Ukraine, and so more people came and moved to that area of Cleveland, Ohio. And they built a Ukrainian Orthodox church where students go to school on Saturdays after they're done with public school in Parma. And they just found, a lot of Ukrainian dishes, a lot of Ukrainian restaurants, that kind of stuff. They found a home. And so because they targeted that specific city in the country, that's kind of how chain migration works. It's very specific. We can talk about Cubans moving to Miami of Florida. We can talk about Germans moving to Cincinnati, Ohio. Anywhere where you have a large population of a particular group of people, because of the success and the cultural existence of other groups in there, that's chain migration. So understand it's very, very specific. Step migration is pretty easy relative to chain migration, I have found in the past. A lot of times students talk about, moving from rural areas to suburban areas to urban areas, which is kind of vague in general. That would be an example of step migration, I suppose. But I would think more along the lines of, the stages that some migrants have to do in order to get to their final destination. It could be that someone from Honduras or Guatemala, they want to escape the violence that I told you guys about that was occurring in those countries. And so they move from their home city to the southern border of Mexico. They find a way into Mexico. It's not an open border either. They find a way into Mexico, save up some money, maybe get stashed for a certain period of time someplace, and then they ultimately migrate to northern Mexico. They take trains, they take caravans, anything like that, and then eventually they move into the United States. Once they get to the United States, they may finally, from family members that have moved to San Francisco or Chicago or Atlanta, whatever case might be, they might eventually get to that destination. So their migration occurred in stages, short movements that ultimately led to a final destination. So it doesn't happen all at once. Intervening opportunity is the presence of a nearer location that prevents people from going a further location. Now this can apply to tourism, right? I would love to go on vacation in Hawaii, but the beaches of Florida are a little closer, a lot closer. Definitely they are cheaper to get to, definitely cheaper to stay, definitely more convenient in terms of time zones and all that kind of stuff. So the intervening opportunity of Florida prevents a lot of people on the East Coast from going to Hawaii or even going to California. You can also look at it as a job opportunity. You might have your heart set on out of college going to New York City for a job, but someone in Atlanta offers you a job that's similar and it's closer to home, so you decide to go to Atlanta instead of moving to New York City. Migration could be the same thing. More migrants that come across the border of with Mexico are going to relocate to Texas or California or Arizona as opposed to Illinois or New York or Massachusetts. They're going to choose those places that might be nearby. Intervening obstacle is the presence of a barrier that prevents you from moving. So the most common obstacles in history have been physical features, right? The impact of oceans, the impact of deserts that prevent people from moving you look at sub-Saharan Africa. The thing that prevents people in sub-Saharan Africa from moving to the Mediterranean is the presence of the Sahara Desert. Intervening obstacle does not have to be a physical feature, however. It could be the presence of a wall, a barricade of some sort, like the DMZ between North and South Korea, or it could be the Berlin Wall between East and West Germany. You could also look at the border between the United States and Mexico. There are a lot of obstacles along that border as well. There are 3 migration terms that are difficult at times for students to differentiate between. You have forced migration, return migration, which is not on the sheet, and counter migration. Now, a forced migration is anytime people are forced to move from a location, typically by the government or by a military. Think of the Trail of Tears with the Native Americans being forced to move from Florida, Georgia, out west. Think Jews being forced to move out of Germany, Russians forcing people to move to Siberia, the Chinese forcing people to move. There are a lot of examples of people being forced out of their home. You guys read about the Sudanese conflict and how those boys were forced out of their homes and forced to flee to South Sudan, forced to flee to Ethiopia and Kenya. All counter migrations are forced. People are compelled to move as well. But in a counter migration, people are forced to go back to where they came from. So think about the Sudanese moving into Ethiopia, and then the boys were attacked and forced back into Sudan. Think about an illegal immigrant from Mexico coming across the border of the United States, gets arrested by immigration, and they are deported back to Mexico. That's a counter migration. It's forced, but you're forced to go back where you came from. And then return migration is a voluntary movement. People voluntarily go back to where they came from. They return home. So, for example, my family moved to London, England when I was 7 years old. It was a voluntary movement. My dad worked there for a couple of years for UPS, and we voluntarily moved back. That's a return migration. Happens very often because people miss being at home. My aunt and uncle moved to San Diego for a while for a job, and they voluntarily moved back to Cleveland because they missed the family. So these people are voluntarily moving back to where they originated. So those 3 are a little tricky to differentiate between. Understand that forced and counter are both forced migrations, but counter, you're going back to where you came. Return migration is voluntary, but you're going back to where you came. So you can understand why a lot of people get confused. Net migration we've already done. Anchor babies I mentioned in I think one class today, but an anchor baby, not a very nice term. Unlike most of the other migration terms that can apply to pretty much any country, any movement, any group of people can use return migration or step migration. Anchor babies is usually referring to illegal immigrants coming to the United States, having a baby because they know that baby will be a legal citizen of the United States by law. There are other countries that have similar laws like this where if you're born in the country, you're a citizen of the country. But typically when you hear this in the United States, it's going to be referring to Hispanic immigrants because they're the ones that are most likely to be able to come in illegally, knowing that they're pregnant and having a baby, or within a year or two they get pregnant and have a baby before they are found out, and the baby is a citizen. So later on in the baby's life, when they're children or maybe teenagers or adults even, they can facilitate chain migration. They can get their parents, maybe their brothers and sisters, they can get them legally to move into the United States because our government tries to unify families. That's one of the easier ways to get into the United States legally is by family reunification, where you have a family member, a close family member, not usually aunts and uncles and cousins, but a really close family member, a brother, sister, a wife, husband, mom, dad, son, daughter, those kind of things, where those people are being reunified with their family. So that's one of the reasons why people purposefully have anchor babies. Now, sometimes it's accidental. They're not doing it maliciously so that they can, beat the system. They just happen to be in the United States. They fall in love, get married, have a child, and that child would be considered an anchor baby. So hopefully that makes sense. Not a term that I would recommend you use in reference to someone. You wouldn't want to call someone an anchor baby. Probably an offensive term for a lot of people. Remittances. I find this when I grade these assignments. I find remittances to be one of the most commonly missed vocabulary terms, because if you look it up in the dictionary, it just says to send money somewhere. Well, in the context of migration, it's a little bit more specific. Remittances are when migrants move into a new country. They make a higher wage usually, right? That's why they move, so they can make more money, and they send part of their paycheck home to their family to support their wives or their children or their husbands or whatever. Remittances are the #1 source of American dollars in Cuba up until recently, because of the embargo that we had with Cuba. And they're the #2 source of American dollars to Mexico. #1 being tourism. But #2, where Mexico gets the most money, is people sending money home to their family, which, I would argue it's a very, whether you agree with, people sending money outside the United States or not, I would argue it's very kind to save up some money where you could definitely use it in the United States, right? A lot of these people are poor immigrants, and we consider them to be low class on our scale, but they still set aside money to send home to their families because they're even poorer. So I think that's overall a very positive thing for those people. Other than that, the rest of the terms on the sheet are pretty straightforward and usually pretty successful for most students. If you have any specific questions about any of the other ones, you can shoot me an email, or you can send me a message on Edmodo, or you can come into the review session tomorrow morning. I do want to remind you, tomorrow's FRQ, it might have some sexy geography terms in it, but you're definitely going to have to apply those terms to some sort of visual stimulus, right? Like we looked at population pyramids, we looked at maps, we looked at charts, we looked at bar graphs, we looked at migration movements, right? So remember what I said. If you get some sort of visual stimulus, make sure you are citing specific information from the stimulus, right? Specific data to support your argument, or specific cohorts of the population if it's a population pyramid, or specific migration patterns if you're looking at a map. And remember, with migration patterns, you definitely want to talk about where the people are coming from and where they are going to. Don't just focus on where they go. You got to have both ends of the migration pattern in order to get full credit from the College Board. So those are my tips, tricks about moving into the more stimulus-driven questions that you might face on the AP exam. I hope that you will watch Mr. Foti's video that I'm going to post on Edmodo, and then of course, if you have any questions for me, post them to Edmodo, email them, or come in the morning for a review session. Good luck, study hard. There's a lot of information on this. I gave you some reading assignments and some websites to visit, so make sure you've done that. But there's a lot of information, but because there's a lot of information, we can't dig too deep. So hopefully this will be a successful test now that you've had a couple of practice tests. Not practice, obviously they counted, but you've had a couple of prior experiences. So I hope this is going to be a better one. Again, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.